The kitchen was completely dark except for the low, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator. I stood there in the shadows holding a cold glass of water, trying to ignore the way my chest was hammering in the silence. Then I felt her fingers slide slowly across my inner wrist, lingering right where my pulse was racing. She didn't pull away. Neither did I. My best friend was sleeping just down the hall, and in that second, the quiet between us felt completely deafening. If you think a woman touching your arm is just friendly, you are missing the one signal that changes everything. I learned that lesson the hard way. And it cost me the only brother I ever had. Julian and I had been inseparable since our freshman year of college. We shared everything. Cramped, cheap apartments. Late-night business ideas scribbled on napkins. Promises that nothing would ever come between us. He was the kind of friend who would drive 3 hours in the middle of the night if your car broke down on some deserted highway. No questions asked. Just headlights cutting through the dark and his voice on the phone saying, "Stay put, I'm coming." Then he met Clara, and the world we had built together began to shift. She was quiet, highly observant. She had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room when she spoke to you. Her eyes would lock onto yours, and everything else would go blurry around the edges. At first, I was genuinely happy for him. They were the perfect couple. The kind that made everyone else feel a little lonely just watching them. Soon we became an inseparable trio. Weekends spent cooking dinners at Julian's place, sitting around his living room talking until dawn painted the windows gray. I always kept my distance from her, highly conscious of the invisible boundary that protected their relationship. She was my brother's future wife. That made her completely off-limits in my mind. Not even a thought. Not even a shadow of a thought. For 2 long years, we lived in that comfortable, safe routine. But looking back now, there were subtle warning signs I desperately chose to ignore. It was the way her eyes lingered on me whenever Julian left the room to grab another drink. Not just a friendly glance. A heavy, loaded gaze that felt almost suffocating. I brushed it off every single time. Told myself I was being paranoid. Then Julian got the promotion. The one that required him to travel 3 days a week. It left a sudden, quiet void in their apartment. And that was when the comfortable routine we all shared began to quietly unravel. It was a rainy Tuesday night when my phone buzzed violently on the nightstand. The screen glowed in the darkness. Her name. A simple message. "Are you awake? Julian's plane is delayed, and the power just went out here." My chest tightened in a way I couldn't explain. 10 minutes later, I was driving through the pouring rain, staring at the rhythmic swipe of the windshield wipers, telling myself I was just being a good friend. When she opened the door, she was holding a single flickering candle. Its weak light cast long shadows across her face. She looked smaller than usual, wrapped in an oversized sweater that I immediately recognized as Julian's. We sat on the cold living room floor, waiting for the storm to pass, talking about nothing in particular to fill the silence. But as the hours wore on, the casual conversation began to drift into dangerous territory. She started talking about how lonely the big house felt when Julian was gone. How his mind always seemed to be somewhere else even when he was sitting right next to her. I didn't know how to comfort her. So I reached out to hand her a glass of water. Instead of taking the glass, her hand gently brushed against mine. It wasn't an accident. Her fingertips traced the soft skin of my inner wrist, right over the pulse point. Her thumb pressed lightly against the vein, lingering there for a long, quiet moment. I froze. My breath caught hard in my throat as the heat of her skin registered against mine. When a woman touches that spot on your wrist, she is testing a very specific boundary. She is feeling for your reaction, waiting to see if your heart rate spikes under her touch. We looked at each other in the dim candlelight. The silence suddenly thick and heavy with something neither of us was brave enough to name. "I'm glad you came," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the rain beating against the window. I pulled my hand back slowly, my heart pounding so hard I was terrified she could actually hear it. After that night, the memory of her touch stayed with me like a lingering fever. I tried to avoid her, made up cheap excuses whenever Julian invited me over. But the tension only seemed to grow stronger with distance. A week later, Julian hosted a small dinner party to celebrate their official engagement date being set. The apartment was crowded and loud. Clinking glasses, the heavy smell of expensive food, laughter bouncing off every wall. I spent most of the evening standing near the narrow hallway, trying my best to blend into the background. But Clara kept finding subtle ways to cross my path. Every time she passed me in the hallway, her hand would graze mine. Always the exact same spot, the inner wrist. A lingering pressure that felt like a secret code only we understood. Once, while Julian was in the kitchen opening another bottle of wine, she stood directly next to me. Her arm pressed against mine. I felt her fingers slide under my watch strap, touching that sensitive skin again. It was an incredibly risky move with a room full of people just around the corner, and I knew I should have stepped away. My body refused to move, but I looked over at Julian. He was laughing heartily, completely oblivious to the betrayal happening just 10 feet away from him. The self-loathing I felt in that moment was sharp enough to cut glass. But when Clara looked up at me, the guilt instantly dissolved into something warmer and far more dangerous. Within days, we started texting regularly. At first it was mundane things, but soon the messages grew longer. Sent later at night, every message felt like a tiny thread pulling us closer to a cliff we both knew we shouldn't jump off. She began showing up at my apartment, borrowing books, dropping off things Julian had supposedly left behind. Each visit followed the same tense, quiet pattern. We would stand in the narrow entryway, the silence between us so heavy it was physically hard to breathe. She would reach out to say goodbye, and her hand would inevitably linger on my wrist. Her thumb slowly tracing circles against my pulse. It was her way of controlling my thoughts without ever saying a single word. I was drowning in the secret, terrified of getting caught, completely unable to pull myself away from her touch. The breaking point came on a cold, foggy Friday evening. Julian was out of town on another business trip. Clara called me, her voice trembling slightly over the phone. She said her car had broken down on the side of a dark road and she didn't know who else to call. When I arrived, the fog was so thick I could barely see the hazard lights blinking on her car. I got into her passenger seat, shook the cold mist from my jacket, turned to look at her. Before I could ask if she was okay, she reached across the console and took both of my hands. She didn't just touch my wrist this time. She pressed her inner wrists firmly against mine, locking our pulses together. It was an incredibly intimate, desperate gesture that bypassed every remaining wall I had built. "I can't do this anymore," she said. Her eyes locked onto mine in the dim dashboard light. "Do what?" My voice was barely a whisper. "Pretend I don't want you." Her fingers tightened around my wrists. That single moment, the last of my restraint shattered completely. The line we had spent months dancing around was finally crossed in the quiet cabin of that car. No turning back. No pretending it was an accident. No way to erase what had just happened between us. The drive back to the city was completely silent, the weight of what we had done settling over us like a suffocating blanket. I went back to my empty apartment and stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, disgusted by the man looking back at me. The next morning, my phone buzzed. Julian's name flashed on the screen, and my stomach heaved with violent nausea. I answered, my voice shaking as I tried to sound like the loyal friend he still believed I was. He wanted to know if I could help him pick out his wedding suit the following weekend. Hearing the excitement in his voice was a physical pain, a sharp twist of the knife I had just buried in his back. I made a quick excuse and hung up. But the suffocating guilt only grew heavier with each passing hour. Over the next few weeks, the paranoia became absolutely unbearable. Every footstep in my apartment hallway made me jump, convinced it was Julian coming to confront me. Clara and I stopped talking entirely. The sudden silence between us filled with mutual regret and cold fear. We had built a fragile house of cards. We both knew the slightest breeze would destroy it. Then the inevitable finally happened. Julian came over to my apartment unannounced one rainy evening. He didn't look angry. He looked completely broken, eyes red and hollow. He sat on my couch, his head in his hands, and told me he thought Clara was seeing someone else. She had become cold and distant. He had found deleted messages from an unknown number on her phone. He looked up at me. eyes filled with tears, asking me what he should do. I had to sit there, looking at my best friend, my brother, and lie directly to his face to protect my own skin. It was the most cowardly thing I have ever done in my life. It felt like a permanent stain on my soul. The worst part was realizing that the subtle touch we had shared had successfully destroyed a decade of brotherhood. She hadn't just touched my wrist. She had pulled the single thread that held our entire lives together. 2 months later, the wedding was called off. Julian never found out it was me. But the constant suspicion and the growing distance between him and Clara became too much to survive. They parted ways quietly, leaving behind ruined plans, broken families, empty promises scattered like wreckage across both their lives. Julian moved to another city to start fresh. We still talk occasionally, but our friendship is a ghost of what it once was. The effortless trust we shared is gone. Even if he doesn't know the real reason why I haven't seen Clara since that dark night in the passenger seat of her car, sometimes I sit in my quiet kitchen at 2 a.m. and think about how easily I fell into the trap. How attraction isn't always loud. How it doesn't always start with an obvious, bold advance. Sometimes it is written in the quietest, most subtle movements of the body. A soft, lingering touch on the inner wrist. A light pressure on a sensitive pulse point. Saying everything without a single word spoken. Now, whenever a woman brushes against my arm, I pull back instantly, my heart racing with sudden fear. Not excitement. Fear. Because once you learn what that touch really means, you realize some secrets are far too expensive to keep. And some friendships, once broken from the inside, stay broken forever. I still feel her thumb against my pulse sometimes, right before I fall asleep. And every single time, I wish I had pulled my hand away when it still would have mattered.